don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Nate Hansford, who is the author of a recent book titled The Scientific Principles of Teaching, Bridging the Divide Between Educational Practice and Research. He goes by Nathaniel Hansford on that book as the author, and you may be familiar with him if you follow social media on Twitter or now Blue Sky as Nate Joseph, and I think he does that to remain somewhat anonymous from his students. Nate is a teacher in Canada and, as I said, an author, and you'll hear us talk about this book, including an exploration of John Hattie's work and what he thinks about that, as well as diving into some of the intricacies and complexities of the science of learning and, of course, inquiry instruction. I appreciated this conversation because, as you'll hear at the end, we both think it's really important to continue to have discussions, even if we disagree, and we did disagree on a few things, but probably agree on much more than we disagree on. Anyways, as usual, I hope it's a helpful conversation as you think about teaching and learning and the complexities and nuances of doing so. As always, I invite you to check out our website, which is wegrowteachers.com, for our professional development and professional learning workshops and services. There you'll find all of those workshops and services, as well as our blog posts and this podcast. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or ideas you'd like to pass my way, feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's that conversation with Nate. I'm here with Nate Hansford, and we're going to talk about his book called The Scientific Principles of Teaching, Bridging the Divide Between Educational Practice and Research. And I'm sure probably at least a few other things, if not much more. But I want to make sure you have an opportunity to introduce yourself and give our listeners a bit of background on who you are. So now's your chance. Who is Nate Hansford, and why is he important?
Well, I don't think I'm important, so let's get that. I'm a teacher, first and foremost. I became interested in education research quite a few years ago now. I'm losing track of the specific time frame, but I was working in a disadvantaged school in the north of Canada, and I felt like my students weren't getting what I wanted them to get out of my classroom teaching. So I went and took some AQ courses, and I got a specialist in reading education and a specialist in special education. Not that those courses or qualifications are particularly impressive. And at the same time, I was reading John Hattie's work, Visible Learning, and I became quickly and acutely aware that what was being taught in my classrooms by my professors wasn't matching what I was reading. And I started to just explore that deeper and challenge my professors and ask them, hey, like, why does your answer differ so much from John Hattie's? What research are you citing? And I oftentimes found my professors, they didn't have citations. They had opinions and theories, but they didn't really have research to support what they're saying. And I became more and more aware that there's this divide between what was popular in education and what I believe to be evidence-based off of the research I was reading. And eventually grew so frustrated, I started a podcast with a good friend of mine. And it sort of snowballed from there into a massive project. And just, over several years, I've written a few hundred articles and a couple books on the topic of the science of teaching.
All right. Well, since you mentioned John Hattie, and the people can't see it, but as I'm holding up his latest, and I've talked with John and a little bit of light reading, 2,100 plus meta-analyses. What do you think of Hattie's? I mean, I'm sure that you've seen the critiques of his work and the meta-analyses, and we're going to get into research because that's a big piece of your book and your work. But, just briefly, like, what's your take on Hattie's work?
I think Hattie revolutionized how people look at education. I think he's a genius in his own right. I think he came up with this basic concept of, well, we have all these meta-analyses on education. Why aren't we referencing them? And he created a secondary meta-analysis where he just ranked teaching strategies based off the effect size found in his first, book, 2008, Visible Learning. And he's gotten a lot of criticism over the years. I think part of the criticism was that original methodology was pretty rudimentary, and there are some flaws with that type of analysis, which I'm happy to get into. However, I think at the same time, the fundamental principle is valuable, almost invaluable, in the sense that as much as, comparing pedagogies is difficult and not an exact science, I think it's actually incredibly necessary. Because, teachers were I'm a teacher, like I'm not a researcher by trade. And we're exposed to so many pedagogies through universities and books and influencers and school boards. I think we have to have some kind of measuring stick at the end of the day to be like, what's effective, what's not. Ask our gut. And I think if we don't have a measuring stick, that's what ends up happening. It really just ends up being a gut feeling of what you think works versus doesn't. And that's not to say that your gut is always going to be wrong. I think sometimes your gut can be right. And just the same as I don't think using meta-analysis is going to get everything right and that you're going to have all the correct answers. But I still think it's better to have some kind of standardized measuring stick opposed to going based off your feelings. So that, he's also, I think, he's really expanded his process over time. His process has gotten better and more refined. And I think one of the most valuable tools he ever created isn't even his book. It's this phenomenal website, which I don't see promoted very often, called Hattie MetaX. And it's just a database, a publicly available, free database of all the meta-analyses conducted on education. And teachers can just scroll through and you click a topic and it'll list all the meta-analyses on that topic. It'll list the mean effect size they found. And it'll give you a small amount of information, like what kind of meta-analysis it was and what was the sample size. So I just think having that database to teachers to be able to quickly look up research is just so invaluable. So as much as like some of the criticisms are valid, I think he doesn't get his due, actually, despite being like a world famous author who's influenced education policy around the world. I think some of the criticism is over the top and unfair. And I'll also say that, there's a funny idea out there. I was reading a paper a couple weeks ago, and it was on precise effect sizes, and it was all about how to estimate the most precise effect size. And I thought it was a funny paper in the sense that I don't think there's such a thing as a precise effect size. Education is such a subjective thing. You have different teachers in different classrooms, different cohorts of students, different backgrounds of students and learning. And then you have to think the teachers before them all had an impact on their learning too. Behavior has an impact. Motivation has an impact. And then you start to go into all the study design features that can impact the results of the study, like assessments used and duration and randomization. And how closely aligned the control group and the treatment group are. And it just gets incredibly complex, incredibly fast. So I think this idea that if we have a precise enough study, we're going to find a precise enough results isn't actually an endeavor worth pursuing fully. Because I think you can go mad trying to find the perfect studies. And I've definitely felt like I've gone a little mad myself trying to do that. But one thing I've noticed is that through that sort of very broad strokes approach that he uses, I think he largely comes to the right answer on most issues, even if sometimes it lacks nuance. And I love Hattie, so I don't want to throw shade his way, but I can admit that sometimes his approach lacks nuance. But sometimes I think it also ends up not mattering. It sort of gets washed out in the numbers anyways. And I'll give a specific example, phonics. So he has, I think, memory serves me correct, he has 13 meta-analyses in his database on phonics. He might have missed one or two, but he's got about 13 in there. And it comes out with a mean effect size of roughly around 0.40, 0.50, somewhere in that range, which is exactly what the most rigorous meta-analyses have found as their mean effect size anyways. And there's some less rigorous meta-analyses that have found larger effect sizes, in that 0.6, 0.7 range. And then there's some more rigorous meta-analyses that are looking at really specific questions that have found some lower effect sizes. But generally speaking, when you average it all out, you still get about what the National Reading Panel meta-analysis found on phonics. And that would be my go-to meta to reference on the subject of phonics. So I just think sometimes it just sort of balances itself out. It's almost like, if you look at a large data pool, we expect there to be outliers on both sides. And as long as the outliers are equal on both sides of the distribution of the data, you should probably still get a pretty relatively accurate mean. And I think that's sort of what ends up happening with Hattie, because he includes all meta-analyses and takes a mean of them. Some of those meta-analyses are more rigorous and have really restrictive questions, and they end up with deflated effect sizes. And some of them are not rigorous enough, and they end up with inflated effect sizes. And the mean in the middle seems to be pretty accurate anyways.
Yeah, one of the things that, to your point, you talk about the way all of the confounding variables and things that affect, any sort of academic outcomes, things that we're trying to measure. I was talking with Oliver Caviglioli, who you're probably aware of, and folks would be aware of if they listened to that episode, but also done some really great illustrations and graphics for, Science of Learning books, Kirshner and Hendricks books, that kind of thing. But one of the things that he pointed out that seems obviously true is there's a big difference between sort of the laboratory results that one might get when doing experiments, which you can't really do in education, and then what happens in the classroom, as you're pointing out. I think all of those sort of confounding things makes it not impossible to draw some conclusions, but there's nothing that you can say is definitive. And that I think is a big piece of why it's so hard to have this conversation productively. I'm curious if we can kind of take a step back. What was your K-12 or whatever you want to call it, education like? How would you describe it?
I think I really just had a mix of teachers, which, coming from Ontario, I think makes sense. Teachers have a ton of autonomy in Ontario. So I had some very strict, very old school teachers who used a very direct instruction lecture type model. And I had some teachers who were very much like sort of, for lack of a better word, liberal hippie teachers who were like, run free with your ideas, experiment. And something that I think that definitely gets lost in these conversations is, so much of these education conversations seems to fall down to a central question of, how much explicit instruction is ideal versus how much inquiry is ideal. But I think every serious person on this topic would say there is some nuance to this, and it's not an answer of the more direct instruction, the better, or the more inquiry learning, the better. And when people tend to phrase the conversation that way, I think it's probably a sign that they're too bought into a camp of learning and that they're not really taking a clear look at the data. But yeah. And I just want to comment, on one thing. You were talking about lab learning versus classroom learning. We do have some lab studies, and I actually tend to put less stock in the lab studies than I do the classroom studies, just because they tend to be really small samples. And learning in a pristine condition or under MRI machines is very different from like trying to manage 30 kids and teach an intervention.
You'd think.
So I put actually a lot more stock into the classroom studies than I do the lab studies. I almost ignore the lab studies.
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me. But of course, as you're mentioning, it's also important to think about all of those external factors that you brought up. Well, your jump into the sort of inquiry direct instruction thing, and anybody who's followed me or followed you, and we've probably intersected a number of times in that conversation. That's one of the things that I really find so frustrating is that it feels like there's a very, very tribal version on either end of, and it's no secret, I'm an inquiry advocate and think it's really important, and I continue to try to have these conversations, and it feels just stilted by I call it tribalism. It's like to me the fundamental question is, what are the outcomes, the academic outcomes we're after? Because to me, especially if we're looking at Hattie's work, it's thinking about teaching with intent, right? It's like, what are the things we're trying to get to? If we're looking at surface and deep and transfer, which are his terms, then the instructional approach, while it's not exactly this, it's aligned with, surface learning. The most efficient way is to do direct or explicit instruction, and we can talk about the differences between those. Then to get into that deeper transfer learning, you want to get into some of those inquiry and collaborative activities as I talk about it, but it's not quite that clean. And
I don't think so either.
yeah, I mean, it's something like that, but it's not exactly that. How do you think about or talk about that? I mean, you talk about it in the book some, but if you don't mind, kind of articulate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I don't love that term of surface and deep, because I almost feel like it ends up being it almost feels pejorative, in the sense that like the types of things we're teaching through direct instruction are, oh, that's just surface learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the irony is I think I have this reputation of being someone who's really an advocate of explicit and direct instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I am,
Mm-hmm.
because I think the research clearly leans towards that direction. But I think if anyone, came into my classroom as a teacher, they'd probably be surprised by how much inquiry-based learning ends up happening. Before I became a teacher, I actually wanted to become a rock star musician. Like, that was my dream. Actually, I wanted to be a punk rocker. So I have a large collection of instruments, of rock music instruments. So, I bring that into my classroom now. Like, there's at the back of my classroom, there's a drum kit, and there's a guitar stand, and there's amps, and there's tons of inquiry-based learning happening in my room, especially actually in math. However, it's scaffolded in. And for me, that's the difference. And I think, the Harmsen and Lazander meta-analysis on inquiry-based learning did a really good job of looking at it. Mm-hmm. Because they compared, a couple things. One of the things they compared was...
Is that the one that's the case for combining direct instruction and inquiry?
Right.
Right.
That's right. Because they compared inquiry-based learning to inquiry-based learning with additional direct instruction.
Right. Differentiating that inquiry.
Right. And they found the higher results was for additional direct instruction. Now, I do think it's a bit of a bummer that they didn't include also a direct instruction moderator variable. Mm-hmm. So we don't get to make that comparison. But it did show that there was large effect sizes found for inquiry-based learning that included additional explicit instruction. And there was a Xi meta-analysis on math instruction in China that found the same thing, that inquiry-based learning with additional explicit instruction showed higher results. But another finding of theirs that was interesting, the differences weren't statistically significant, but there was a linear trend with ages. So the younger students were, the less effective inquiry-based learning was, and the older students were, the more effective inquiry-based learning was. And if you go look at Hattie's MetaX database on inquiry-based learning meta-analyses, you'll find that there's a clear trend where studies on older students, especially in the sciences, show really large effect sizes. But we don't seem to have that same level of proof in the younger grades, especially for things like math and English. This is right. I think a better way of looking at it is not deep learning versus surface learning. It's just scaffolding. I would love to go to math just for a second, because I think, one thing that constructivists have wrong about math is they said, well, ultimately we want students to be problem solvers. So we want students to be able to solve abstract and difficult problems. So there was a lot of focus on giving them really difficult situational problems and not necessarily teaching them the algorithms to go with it at the start. At least that's been my experience. And this is, on one hand, it makes sense. It's like, yeah, of course we want students to be able to solve abstract problems. Obviously, that's the goal. But if students don't have the background knowledge in math and the scaffolding and the training so that they can apply formulas and concepts they've already learned to those abstract problems, I think it ends up sort of being a waste of time. And then the students don't get out of that what they could have. So whereas I have a ton of inquiry-based learning in math in my class, it's typically scaffolded in towards the end of units, towards the end of the school year. And it's I teach my students on a very individual basis in math. So as my students progress through the curriculum, they get more and more inquiry-based learning. Whereas when they're more of a beginner in math, they get more and more explicit instruction. And it's not that the knowledge they're learning from explicit instruction is less valuable or surface learning. It's just that it's the fundamental steps that they need to make that higher order learning more valuable later on.
Yeah, it's what I say is necessary but not sufficient. And referring back to the Lysander, that work, thinking about, and we talk about this in our inquiry workshops. We say we want to make sure that, number one, students are ready for inquiry, and if they're not ready for inquiry, then you've got to scaffold and do some explicit work to build those inquiry skills. Because and the thing that I'm sure you've seen on social media, but the thing that drives me crazy, of course, Paul Kirshner and Sweller talking about basically conflating what I think is a conflation of discovery learning and inquiry. And Lysander, their work talks about essentially that guided inquiry, and trying to figure out what is that sort of level of scaffolding that is necessary, whether it's on knowledge or whether it's on inquiry or whatever it is. You've got to scaffold appropriately, and not, productive struggle gets a bad name, but you want them to be, in my estimation, I don't know how you feel about this, be right at that edge of challenge where they're not bored, they're challenged, but they're not shutting down because it's so hard, which is what discovery learning could certainly, and often I would imagine, would do. And so, you want to sort of be twiddling the knobs, which is, you've got some instructional design, some intentional moves that a teacher would do, but then some of that has to be, I think, that intuitive piece where you're perceiving what the students are understanding. You've got to make that thinking visible so that you can get it out, and so you can recognize what they know, what they don't know, what they need, what they don't need, and then kind of react, appropriately. So I don't know, if you have any thoughts on any of that.
I have so many thoughts on that. My mind is racing, actually. I just want to start by saying that I think so much time gets wasted on the nomenclature, because oftentimes we're speaking different languages when we talk to each other, even in the explicit instruction side. And to be fair, I have absolute respect for Kirshner. He's a brilliant scholar. He's much more,
as I do too.
So I don't want anyone to think I'm putting him down, but I think discovery-based learning, I see two different models of discovery-based learning. And I believe I wrote about that in my book, that there seems to be two different interpretations of what discovery-based learning means. I sort of see that free school model of discovery learning, which is basically like there's no restrictions on the student and no real explicit instruction. It's all self-exploration. Right. Or you have more of that lesson model where the teacher has some kind of game or activity in which the student is supposed to discover knowledge, but it's not being explicitly taught to them.
More episodic.
But it's still carefully constructed scenarios, It's a very simple example being like if you have students folding paper in the hopes that they learn that a triangle is half a square. I would say that's a form of discovery-based learning. And when I think of inquiry-based learning, I think that's more of what I use. I don't think I ever use really discovery-based learning for the most part. I think of more when we give students independent research choices and options and projects that are self-directed but still scaffolded and guided. And then on the direct instruction side, I think we almost get more bogged down in definitions because there's some really specific definitions of different kinds of direct instruction that exist out there in the scholarly. And sometimes researchers get mad at me because I'll give a very vague definition for direct instruction. And I do that not unintentionally, but intentionally, because I think we almost take power away from words when we say, oh, there's a specific format to a direct instruction lesson plan. Direct instruction, I believe, is a sort of just almost a self-exploratory or explanatory concept in the sense that we're just saying it's providing additional explicit instruction to students. But then you got into that lower DI versus that harder DI. I would definitely say I'm a lower DI teacher for the most part. Lowercase, right? In the sense that I'm providing a lot of scaffolding and explicit instruction to my students, but I'm not following a script. Full disclosure, I sell a reading program. We don't really make a profit off it. In fact, most of the components are completely free. But I intentionally made that as unscripted as possible because I'm not a fan of scripted. And that's not to say that scripted is a bad thing. I think scripted can be a good thing in certain contexts, especially for newer teachers or younger teachers or people who just don't feel confident in the material they're teaching. But it's not something I've ever felt passionate about. Whenever I've been given a script to follow, I feel particularly uninspired in my teaching. And I believe that leads to lower engagement. And I do worry too that it leads to less responsive teaching. And I'm sure I've offended somebody by saying that. But again, I think there's a time and a place for scripted learning. But I think because we tend to use direct instruction in social media conversations and inquiry-based learning as just two catchphrases. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes when constructivists talk about direct instruction, they mean that scripted model. And they mean like they picture a teacher standing at the front reading from a script in a book.
Choral response.
Right. And then I think sometimes the direct instruction people, when they talk about inquiry-based learning, they picture a teacher in a free school movement where there's no real carefully constructed learning happening. So I think we got to be a little careful about how those words are being used.
Yeah. So what's your, I guess, take or perception or maybe reaction? I'm not sure quite what the right word would be. When like, how do you think about the sort of science of learning movement? Because when I think about science of learning, what I tend to associate that with is direct and or explicit instruction, capital D, small d, explicit, Engelman, Rosenshine. I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? Kirshner, all those things. But all that is sort of very much anti, and this is my take, that they really just put down inquiry. They put anything that's not direct or explicit instruction because it's efficient, and I'd say that's important. Learning is certainly, in my estimation, more than just change in long-term memory, and so I think of that science of learning as sort of that sort of tribe or movement, and others think about it more expansively. I just published a podcast with Zaretta Hammond, who talks about culturally responsive teaching, and she's talking about a lot of other things. I mean, just not even really wanting to engage in that direct and explicit instruction versus inquiry kind of argument. Lots of metacognition, and I mean, I could go on. But how do you think about the sort of defining or the elevator pitch for science of learning?
Yeah, well, I think I have very mixed feelings on it. On the one hand, I think tribal-based thinking is dangerous across the board. I think you see it in politics. A lot of people don't know this because I try not to talk about politics anymore because it disenfranchises people trying to learn about learning and teaching. But I was very interested in politics before I got into this. And I think, in politics, this tribal mentality of I'm in this party, you're in that party is incredibly toxic. And I think it seems to be like a natural human phenomenon. You see with sports, you see people willing to fight each other over a sports team. I can't think of anything more asinine than that. But I think that's definitely an element of these conversations. But I also think that we have sort of two different philosophical movements that are driving these things. And I think part of why it's hard for inquiry-based learning people and direct instruction people to get along is the value system is different. So I think a lot of the people who are on that constructivist side, that inquiry-based learning side, they came out of the social movements that birthed after World War II. I think it's almost a response to fascism. There was this want to have a more democratic school system, want to have more socially normal values within the classroom. We talked about culturally responsive teaching, seeking joy from children and happiness from children and learning through creativity. And I think all of that's actually admirable. And on that issue, I think I side far more with the constructivist than I would a direct instruction person. The problem where I get into this is I think then we wanted to justify that within academia by saying this is better for learning. These methods are better for learning. And I think, for lack of a better word, there was some mumbo jumbo that was put out there. There was just we had a lot of theory papers and case studies that were published, and they were put in peer-reviewed journals, and they were attributed as science, and I don't think they really were. And then I think you have some really serious scholars from that direct instruction camp who point to scientific studies, say, hey, like this doesn't seem to be the thing that maximizes learning. And one thing I really tried to hammer home in the book is it's okay to acknowledge both. When I looked at the national education systems in the world that have the highest achievement, It's for the most part, it's the Asian countries. Asian countries have far more academic achievement on average than Western countries. And we often put the Nordic countries on this pedestal, which have the most progressive education systems, generally speaking. And they seem very idealized from a Western perspective. But their academic achievement is substantially lower on average on the NRS tests than is the Asian countries. And I think what we really have to do as a society is determine, how do we balance these two goals? Because I definitely want my students to be critical thinkers. I want them to be creative. I want them to be students who can solve problems and invent things. But I also want to make sure they're literate and they have an understanding of math. And I'm not going so far in that, for lack of a better word, liberal direction that I'm hampering their learning. And I think the first step to doing that means we have to be completely honest about what we're seeing. I think the goals of these two movements is different. One is talking about how do we maximize learning, and one is talking about how do we improve the social well-being? How do we improve the social fabric? How do we improve happiness of children? And I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive goals either. I think there's ways we can tie these things together. But part of it, I think, means evaluating each individual pedagogy and idea and concept on its own rather than as a whole. And I think that's part of the problem we fall into as a camp. People want to say, well, everything from this camp is bad and everything from this camp is good, and every scholar from this camp is right and every scholar from this camp is wrong. And I think that's part of where we get into danger. And I think that's part of why we get these pendulum swings that anyone who's been a teacher will tell you about, that you get wild pendulum swings. I've been in schools where I've been told not to teach math formulas, just full stop, don't teach math formulas. I got told off by a coach in a school once for having posters of math formulas on my board, trying to teach students how to use those math formulas. They said that I should let the kids play with the numbers for a month before teaching them. And in my mind, that's bad teaching. However, I've been in the opposite extreme, and I'll just say it was in England, where I taught in a school where, the average teacher works 60, 70 hours a week. And we were told that in order to give any grade to a student, we had to have 3 artifacts from that student filed away in a cabinet to justify in case an inspector came into our room to ask us what the grade of the student was. So the stress of that kind of education system, I don't think is healthy or positive. But I also think that we can't go so far with it that we're sacrificing literacy and numerical knowledge. So I think it all becomes just a balancing game. But I think the first step is just being transparent about our values.
Yeah, well, I guess the values are the outcomes, right? That's the thing that seems to be lost in lots of the conversation that I'm having, and I feel, I've said this on Twitter or X or whatever. It's like, it's not, we can't have this conversation meaningfully in this space, in these 280 characters or whatever.
Yeah, you can't. That's right.
Right. And, I'm happy to have it, podcast or other ways, even pick up the phone. I'll be happy to talk with some of these people who just seem intent on saying, the research shows this, and this. Yes, the research does show that, and I advocate for that as well. I tell teachers quite frequently, if you're teaching reading and if you're teaching math, basic math skills especially, don't use inquiry. Please don't do that. That would be a terrible use of your time. You might couch some math skills inside of inquiry, but when it's time to teach them those formulas, use direct or explicit instruction. But as I think about inquiry, one of the things that I want to have as an outcome, and this is really hard, again, 280 characters is impossible to have this conversation, but the outcomes are more qualitative and they're more slippery. And what I have an intuitive sense of, curious how you think about this, is that when we're engaging students in inquiry, you mentioned some of the outcomes in younger years and then getting better in older years, and I assume those are in measuring some sort of knowledge or something like that. That there are inquiry related skills and abilities that we develop, and it seems intuitively true to me that we get better. There's a sort of cumulative effect to doing that over time that then maybe crystallizes at some developmental stage. I've not seen research for it. I'd love to see research for it because that would help my conversation a lot. But it's just, I think, going to be really, really hard to quantify and put into research. So the opportunity cost of not engaging students at a younger age in some of that inquiry, if my intuition is true, is that as they get older, they haven't had that cumulative effect. And one of my hypotheses is that part of our polarization and issues of politics and inability to talk with each other is that we just have not been able to have those kinds of conversations in our classrooms to a large extent. And I wouldn't say that's the only variable and factor there, but it seems intuitively true to me and important to be doing inquiry, even if it's not immediately quantifiable and perhaps not even eminently quantifiable down the road. I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that. In fact, I've heard Dr. Corey Pelletier say almost the identical thing, and he's definitely firm in the science of math camp or science of learning camp. And, I want to throw one quick thing out here. I kind of love and hate the whole idea of the science learning movement, because I felt when I first started my own journey on this, I felt kind of like there wasn't a lot of people saying this. And all of a sudden with the science of reading movement, there's just been an explosion of people. And I feel like there's a community of people open to this conversation. And it's really nice to see people doing it. But I definitely see tribalism emerge with it too. And that always makes me nervous. But I think one of the things that inquiry-based learning does really well is it builds self-efficacy. I think, this project of my own was really an inquiry-based learning project. I'm self-taught about research. I learned research by reading just studies over and over again, and then blogging about it and talking about it and writing books on it. And then, every time I wrote something, there was, for every nice thing that someone had to say about it, there's always somebody out there being like, oh, you're an idiot. You didn't think of this. And as much as that was often a tough conversation to read, someone be like, oh, you're so dumb. It also helped me to learn and grow and develop. I still think there's a way to have respectful conversations with people when you disagree with them. But at the same time, it's definitely a valuable learning experience to get feedback from other people.
Oh, yeah.
I think that translates to other areas of life. I feel more confident now to learn about new topics. A random confession on this podcast, I've been learning how to salsa dance. And I think learning about education research has given me more confidence to learn how to dance. Another thing I think that I've heard other people talk about this in the research. I don't have a good citation to share, so I might be talking on my butt here. This is at least partially my opinion, but I think I have personally found that inquiry-based learning works really well for gifted students and students further on in their journey. And I think I like to think of this as an RTI model. RTI model is basically that the more student struggles, the more explicit instruction we give them. So if a student doesn't get the math, explain it to them more deeply, give them more examples, spend more one-on-one time with them. If the student is getting the math on their own, take the brakes off, let them go wild with it, let them go ahead of the curriculum, let them work ahead, give them inquiry-based learning projects. I once had a student start coding their own self-marking lessons on calculus in grade 8. That couldn't have happened through a direct instruction model because I'm not good at calculus and I'm not good at coding. So by just taking the brakes off of that student and letting them do more self-exploratory learning, I think they learned far more than had I been trying to just say, no, everybody's been going at the same pace. We're all going to be using direct instruction. So I think some of the highest learning happens through inquiry-based learning. So you would never hear me say we should never use inquiry-based learning. You talked about this earlier when you're teaching literacy and math, there has to be direct instruction. I don't know if that's always true, but I think it's always true for beginning readers and your math students or students who are struggling with math. Math is a really complicated subject because there's so many concepts and procedures to learn. And by the way, there's this weird phenomenon I find where people think inquiry-based learning is for teaching concepts and direct instruction is for teaching procedures. I don't think that's true at all. I think you can definitely use both methods to teach both types of knowledge. I don't understand any connection between the type of teaching and the type of concept being taught. But generally speaking, I really wouldn't want to see a lot of inquiry-based learning in a grade 1 class or a grade 2 class for language and math. And that's not to say that it can never be there. It's just it can't be the foundation of the instructional approach. Science and history, I think they lend themselves more easily to inquiry-based learning to some extent, but I still think there's place for direct instruction. When I teach science now, I teach it very differently now than I did a couple years ago. I used to teach science more explicitly, more like here is the information and here's what you need to know, and there's still a place for that. But now I definitely try to include an inquiry approach in the sense that, when my students write a lab report, we base it off of the scientific method that we write lab reports for my class, like you would submit a peer-reviewed scientific article. We have an introduction section, a method section, a results section, and a discussion section. And that's to get them open to the idea of the scientific model. And I teach them that science isn't really so much a body of knowledge as it is a process. It's a systematic process for finding truth through experimentation. And that is at the core of science. So I think, science is built on the very idea of inquiry. And again, there's no reason you can't teach some students some fundamental concepts in science through explicit instruction. But if you're excluding all inquiry-based learning from your science lessons, I actually think you're probably doing something wrong. And that's probably a controversial position. Some people in my camp would probably get angry at me here to say that. And history is sort of a similar thing. Definitely you need some direct instruction in history class. Students aren't going to learn all the facts of history on their own. But I think students also have to realize that we see history from different perspectives, and that a valuable part of history is exploring those different perspectives. And I think that's best done through an inquiry approach, not a direct instruction approach. I'm not going to sit at the front of the room and be like, well, this was the First Nation perspective, and this was the white person perspective.
Well, just as a side note, because you made that distinction, I've said this before on the podcast, but it strikes me as what seems to be true is that a lot of the sort of hardliners of the direct or explicit instruction approach, like Anastaki, their math, their science, and I was a social studies teacher, and so I do wonder about that kind of distinction. Zach Rochelle teaches a lot of math, I think, or did, and so I think that's an interesting dynamic there. But one thing I wanted to I guess ask about in a wrinkle here, because I agree with you about the role of inquiry in like foundational math, and if students are struggling with those kinds of things. But could it be, because this is another, I think, hard thing about inquiry, because it is such a sort of nebulous kind of term. We can use inquiry in a way to sort of couch or position or contextualize the math in this case in a way that might drive some engagement that might then help us get to the engagement in that direct or explicit instruction on those math concepts. So does that, how do you think about engagement and inquiry? Because as I think you mentioned, like you can sometimes see direct or explicit instruction and students are like, okay, yeah, whatever, this is boring. And it doesn't have to be there. I don't want to straw man or caricature it, but it certainly can be.
No, it definitely can be. I do want to say, I want to give a shout out to Anastaki and Zach Rochelle, because those are two people I know pretty well, I think. I think they're both great people. I think they do great things, but I definitely think there's a place for inquiry in any grade, in any subject. I think it's about finding that balance, though. So for math, like I said, the younger the students, the less I'd want to see inquiry-based, the more I want to see direct. I would, say in grade 1 class, I might want to see 90% direct instruction, maybe 10% inquiry. And these aren't based off any research studies. That's just my gut. Mm-hmm. Ironically, I started off this podcast talking about why you shouldn't trust your gut. But, whereas I get to a grade 8 class, it might be more student dependent. If I have a really advanced student, they might be doing 50, 60% inquiry and 40% direct instruction. Whereas I might have a struggling student, they might be getting 100% direct instruction. I definitely think inquiry can be used for engagement. And But I generally speaking think it's best towards the end of a unit, the end of a lesson, the end of a year, because I don't want and here's where maybe I don't love that term productive struggle. And I'll give some specific examples of where I don't want to see productive struggle or how I don't want to see it. I've seen lessons where the teacher gives the kids a hard math problem and they don't have the tools to solve it. And the hope is that they talk amongst themselves and they work it out together and they find the answer, and it's a more meaningful experience. It's a more engaging experience. But I think what ends up happening is oftentimes one or two kids try really hard and figure it out. And then most of the class ends up twiddling their thumbs, watching those kids completely unengaged. And then they feel stupid at the end of the lesson. And I was never someone who's really naturally good at math. So I think when I was in those types of lessons as a kid, I was the kid twiddling my thumb, giving up, reading a book under my desk, not paying attention. So I think that model can be more damaging than good. But I'll give you an alternative. You teach students the concepts, all the information they need to know. Sorry, I got to sneeze. You can leave that in. Don't edit that out. I don't believe in editing. But you teach students all the concepts they need to solve a problem, all the formulas they need to solve a problem. And then you give them a difficult problem to stretch that knowledge, to give them that stretch peaks, to give them that test of application to the real world. I think that can be really valuable. And I think it can help build self-advocacy. And I think students need those experiences, and they need repeated exposures to those experiences, because students need to learn how to solve a difficult problem. That's a skill in itself. Believing in yourself enough to try is a skill in itself. And I don't think it happens through zero exposure. I don't think we want school to be, we try all problems neatly worded on worksheets where everything is super concrete and they can easily apply the formula to it. It's just pure memorization. But I also want to make sure that whatever we're asking students to do, we've taught them the tools they need to solve that. I'm a big believer in teaching to the test, by the way, which is a controversial concept. But I think if we're teaching students something, if we're testing students something and we haven't taught them, why the hell are we testing them? I think that doesn't make any sense. If I give a test to my students, you can be damn certain that everything on that test is something I've taught.
Yeah. So I would agree with you the way you characterize productive struggle, but I wouldn't call that particularly productive struggle. I would call it, fairly unproductive struggle. And I've seen that with my own daughters. Supposedly working in groups at a whiteboard, and there's 3 or 4 of them, and there's really one of them doing it, and the teacher's not checking for understanding, and that's a problem. The thing that I think is partially important here, or partly important here, is, especially, again, we're talking about math, and that tends to be about answers more than, like a social studies class, that kind of thing, humanities class. And so one of the things I think is an important distinction, I've tried to make this, is the difference between an ill-defined problem, which you would want to teach those algorithms to be able to figure out how to solve that ill-defined problem, and an open-ended problem of which there might be several answers, which, of course, in math, there generally aren't several answers. And so I think that when we're thinking about an open-ended problem, that wrestle and that struggle and thinking through the ways in which you might answer it from different perspectives is a different dynamic than what we would want to see just saying, all right, see if you can figure this out without me giving you the algorithms or the formulas or that kind of thing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess that might be where we differ. I mean, I would never give students a math problem in which I had not previously given them the formulas they need to solve that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's only one formula or one answer. Sometimes I teach kids multiple formulas for a problem. In fact, I'm a big believer in this. And the shout out to Dr. John Starr, who was the one who really made me try this more. But sometimes I don't know what it is, but kids just can't wrap their heads around a specific formula. So rather than trying to ram that formula onto the students, I try to find, well, what's another way that I can teach them this? What's a completely different approach? A good one is fractions. I talked about this one with Anna Stockey, actually. on my podcast. And I don't know what it is, but some kids really struggle finding the common denominator. Well, there's two different ways you can find a common denominator. If they're struggling with the first way, I teach them the second way. And then if they're still struggling, then I think, okay, well, you know what? Real life applications of math, if they're a student struggling with fractions, they're far more likely to use decimals in real life. Let's just teach them how to convert these fractions to decimals and then solve the problems as decimals. As an adult, I don't know if I've ever used a fractions math problem once in my life, but I have done a ton of decimal work, far more than I can count. So I think it's more useful to teach it in that way. But I think ideally we want students to know both. But if students are really struggling with fractions, I'll just teach them how to do it as a decimal problem instead, because it's a lot easier. But generally speaking, I always want to make sure that I've given them the tools. That doesn't mean that there's no open-ended problems. You know, I did an exercise just a couple of days ago where I was showing card hands, and I was saying, well, what's the probability that this card will be in our next hand? And we calculated that. That's a pretty open-ended problem. There's lots of different ways they could work on solving it. But I think, generally speaking, I always want to at least have shown them something that they could use. It doesn't mean that there's a specific way of doing it, but.
All right. Well, so I would characterize that as not necessarily open-ended, because you're saying there's different ways to get to the answer, but there is an answer. There's a probability answer. So an example, might be in social studies, for example, does the executive branch in the United States or anywhere have too much power? And that's an open-ended question.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
And while there might be a few different ways to try to figure that out, there's a set of knowledge. So, just to sort of line out the details, what do we need to know? What do we need to know? What are the three branches of government? What are their roles? What's the role of federalism? Maybe some of the history behind it. So that would be where I would scaffold in that knowledge, that surface knowledge, if you want to call it that, which I know you don't want to call it that, surface learning. But then giving the students the chance, if we really want to dive into that inquiry process, to say, with my help and my modeling, what do we need to know? Well, let's think about these things. Let's really, consider and make a list of those things we need to know. And then that's when I teach them. I would do a lesson and, very likely direct or explicit instruction on federalism and the role of the executive branch and the history and what has happened historically. And we might transfer it to a different country and look in Canada or Korea or whatever. So that's an open-ended problem where there isn't necessarily an answer. It's a number of different answers and perspectives, and we're talking about it. And so the level of productive struggle and the way it might characterize or might look would be different than in a math class. And that's kind of to my point, right? So many of the conversations seem to be so focused on the sort of process of solving problems in math, and there's an answer for that.
Yeah, I think that might be, though, in part because that's where there's a greater debate. There are definitely people having debates on how do we teach history. And I'd probably say we need a very middle approach. Like the Ontario curriculum, for example, it really likes to phrase teaching history as a skill process. I'm a history teacher by trade originally. That's what I went to school for. And I've taught as a history teacher in high school before. I don't love the idea of history being viewed as discrete skills that can be taught through an inquiry approach. I think that's a vast oversimplification of what history is. But I also don't love the idea that history is being taught as whatever the history teacher thinks it is, and he's standing at the front of the room telling the class what is history. So I think both of those ideas can be damaging. You definitely need to find something in the middle. I think math ends up being more of a debate because in part, maybe because we have some more extreme positions on it. I could definitely know of book authors and influencers who are very, very popular, not so much researchers that I can think of, but authors and influencers who promote a very extreme version of discovery-based learning, in my opinion. That whole teach completely open-ended, no formulas, no scaffolding. And I find that disturbing, to be honest. That's one that really bugs me is the no formulas. I think that's the most damaging idea in education, actually, is anyone who's saying don't teach kids formulas. And I find that one damaging because, I'm someone who was never good at math per se, and I think I'm relatively good now, but I was never someone who was naturally good. I had to work really, really hard at math. True story, when I was in grade 9, I was in the academic or the advanced stream of math, and my grade 9 math teacher told me, if you don't drop my class next year and go down a level, I'm going to climb up on the roof and kill myself. He said that in front of the whole class.
No pressure.
So yeah, he's a great guy, very charming individual. But I couldn't have learned math without teachers teaching me formulas directly. And you know, shout out to a random YouTuber, Math Antics, taught me so much math, because about 10 years ago I went to teach grade 7 math for the first time, and I realized I didn't know the curriculum. I just sat down with a textbook and the curriculum documents and YouTube, and I learned the whole curriculum in about a week, because I got hired to teach that class after Christmas break, and it was on Christmas vacation. So I decided I had to learn all of grade 7 math in a week. And I did. And there's no way I could have done that through an inquiry-based approach. So I think that for me, that's why I get my back up against the wall when people say, oh, well, we can't teach formulas. I've even heard some people say, well, formulas aren't learning, they're memorization or regurgitation, something to that effect. I think that's a harmful narrative. But, you know, again, we don't have to jump to extremes.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned skills as one of the things I wanted to ask you about. When you think about skills, how do you define them? And maybe you can give some examples of those history ones, although I don't know if they're necessarily relevant to my question specifically. But, you know, people will say, you know, we can't teach skills. Some of the research says that, you know, some of the skills or critical thinking is domain specific, not transferable outside of domains. I certainly think myself that there are some skills that are generalized and generalizable. People will say and have arguments with me about, you know, skills not being something you can assess. I would disagree, and I can certainly give examples of what that might be, but I'm curious how you think about skills, critical thinking. You know, there's a sort of bucket of those kinds of things.
Okay, well, I'm going to be honest. This isn't a thing I've thought very deeply about. It sort of feels above my pay grade, for lack of a better word. When I first started getting interested in this and interest in science in general, I thought the why was an incredibly valuable question. And I've generally speaking given up on why. And I think your question kind of gets to the, you know, why we should teach what way in a sense. But I've given up on explaining why things work the way they do in education, because truthfully, I don't know. Anytime I have a hypothesis, it seems to get disproven really quickly by a new study. And I just think it's an incredibly challenging thing to do. And one thing I think people on both sides do is they speak with too much confidence. They say really confidently, you know, oh, skills can't be taught, or skills must be taught. And I think it's more valuable to focus on what teaching things we can do to benefit learners, and to focus on these deep philosophical questions of, you know, is skill basically, because I've seen people say things like, well, skills are just subsets of knowledge. I don't even really know what that means in a sense, because, you know, it depends on what we're using by the word skill. Like if I throw a football, that's a skill. If I'm good at throwing a football, you can definitely teach kids how to throw a football. So I think when we talk about skill, we mean like the skill of critical thinking. But you know, in my personal experience, I think I've seen students develop higher levels of critical thinking. And yeah, some of that's probably background knowledge dependent. If they know the topic better, they're going to think more critically about that topic. But I'll give a really specific example. I've seen a lot of people say reading comprehension is not a skill that can be taught. And I'm sure there's a degree or element of truth to that, in the sense that I don't think reading comprehension is one skill. I think it's probably a collection of skills and bodies of knowledge that sort of work together in a series of processes that are more complicated than I could easily explain. And yet, we have scientific studies which look at teaching things like main idea and testing, do students get better at comprehension after we teach them how to find the main idea. And pretty consistently across the research, we find, yes, they do. And I would argue, well, if reading comprehension isn't a skill, teaching students to find the main idea shouldn't improve reading comprehension. And yet it does. So sometimes the people who say we can't teach skills are also the people saying, well, we shouldn't be teaching main idea in literature in language class. And I'm not, when I bring this up, they often say, well, we were doing too much main idea instruction, or it was, in a really simplistic way of like skill of the week. Like this week, we're going to teach main idea. Next week, we're going to teach summarizing. And that might be true. But I also think it might be an oversimplification to say that reading comprehension is not a skill and can't be taught, because I think it's probably a really complicated answer. And I wouldn't want to oversimplify it in any way.
When you say critical thinking, do you have a shorthand, a back pocket definition of what that, when you think of critical thinking?
No, I don't know. I think intuitively we all sort of know what critical thinking is, but trying to define it, especially on the spot, is a pretty hard task.
Mm-hmm. I tend to think of it, and to your point about, some of the things you just mentioned there, it's a collection of other things. It's a small, different pieces. It's, if I'm asking students to analyze something, I think that's critical thinking. If I'm asking them to evaluate something, that's critical thinking. They have to have some knowledge to do that. They're thinking about the interconnectedness or whatever. If I'm asking them to generate a list of questions, and that's why I think inquiry is a really important skill to develop and model, because at some point, while I think knowledge is obviously important, we want to be giving knowledge to students through their educational experience. You're going to be an adult at some point, and you're going to have a problem, and you're not going to have somebody feeding you the knowledge. You might, as you've done, go find a YouTuber or whatever to get that knowledge, but you've got to figure out, what do I need to know? And so developing that skill, I think, is a generalizable skill that we want to instill in as many of our students as possible, even if it's not immediately quantifiable.
Yeah, I agree with that to some extent. I mean, on a number of occasions, a kid has asked me a question and I have not known the answer. And I said, well, let's just go look it up because I don't know. And part of what I'm doing is, one, I'm trying to be honest with my own limitations with the students and be like, hey, I don't know everything. But two, just show them like, hey, just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean you can't be look up. We're in this golden age of information, truthfully. I mean, it's got some real negatives because there's lots of bad sources of information on the internet, but you want to learn out about any topic, you can go to Google, you can go to YouTube, you can go to ChatGPT, and you can just start learning. Honestly, it's amazing the resources that are out there. Just shout out back to John Hattie. Like, there's a database of all the meta-analysis ever done on education, completely free on the internet. You can just search up MetaX, and you could get a mountain of knowledge just by pouring through his database, I think. But there's just so many topics where you could do something like that and learn a new skill. So being able to go to the internet and look up answers to questions and think deeply about things, I think that's a skill. But I think the problem is that it's not an either or. Like, I'm sure that critical thinking is a collection of skills, as you put it, but it's also a reflective of a body of knowledge, and
right.
Probably a series of bodies of knowledge. And trying to neatly define it into one thing, I don't know. That's above my pay grade. That sounds like educational theory, and I'd stay away from that as much as I can.
Well, I think you can definitely do critical thinking and ask questions without knowledge, but you do better critical thinking and ask better questions with knowledge. So that's one of the things that I continue to talk with teachers about when we're working on project-based learning and inquiry is if somebody's telling you in project-based learning that you're not supposed to teach and you're not supposed to give knowledge and you're not supposed to do direct or explicit instruction or an inquiry, send them my way because I'd like to have a word with them, because that's I think a very valid critique of progressive constructivist kinds of education. Get back to sort of what we were talking about originally is, this tribalism and the idea that that we're not supposed to do any inquiry, which I've had very prominent people say, oh, we do not do inquiry. And inquiry is bad, and inquiry is bad for kids. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And full disclosure, I think they are actually doing inquiry, but just can't possibly articulate it because it's become such a boogeyman. But that's a whole other kind of conversation. Well, the book is The Scientific Principles of Teaching, Bridging the Divide Between Educational Practice and Research. Of course, we'll put in the show notes and all those kinds of things. Are the things we didn't talk, actually, much specifics about the book, and definitely recommend folks pick it up. Some real great stuff in it. But are there things that you wanted to talk about that we haven't talked about before we get going here?
No, you know what? I enjoyed this conversation and having just sort of broad general discussion. And, I knew you were kind of more on the constructivist side. And I kind of came into this conversation thinking about that. And generally speaking, I think having more dialogue between people in these camps is a good thing. I definitely consider myself a science of learning person, a science reading person, although I have mixed feelings about the terminology and the nomenclature. But at the same time, I think there's just value in having conversations with people. And I think that was something I wanted to get across with the book, is that, I'm not trying to give people answers. I'm trying to give people just an understanding of what general research has shown and an understanding of some of the pros and cons of different types of approaches, and give people the power to realize we just have to determine for ourselves what are we valuing in our classroom environment, and be honest and transparent about that.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've gone back and forth about a little bit is that transparency, and probably too late to get too deep into the weeds, but things like project follow through or cognitive load theory research, like, let's be transparent about the quality of that research and the shortcomings, even if they are really important, and certainly lots of lessons to be taken from that. But it doesn't mean that it's perfect, and that just like any piece of research, Hattie notwithstanding, there's critiques to be made, and we've got to be transparent about that. So I don't know if there's a late addition to the conversation, but feel free to comment on any of that.
I will say that I just don't think there's such thing as a perfect piece of research, and people like to put individual studies on both sides up on pedestals. And I feel like it's sort of a fool's endeavor to try and find the best study of a thing. I think it's better to have a broad overview, and that's kind of an unfortunate answer too, because it means I can't give people like simple answers like, oh, you read this one study, you know everything. Right. I can't say it.
That's what they do on social media.
But at the same time, different study designs have different strengths and weaknesses, and you're never going to find a study that has everything covered perfectly and no weaknesses. And just like there's a value in replication. I once told, I've said this on a few podcasts before, but I once said to Dr. Corey Peltier that I didn't think something was science until it was proven through meta-analysis. And he told me he didn't think something was science until it had been proven in multiple meta-analyses and replicated, which is an incredibly high bar. Very few things meet that standard.
Right.
But I do think there's some truth to that, because, no two meta-analyses are even alike. So this idea, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Oftentimes they have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. One might have a weaker inclusion criteria and look at more studies, and one might have a stricter inclusion criteria, look at less studies, but look at more rigorous studies. And comparing those two meta-analyses is a bit like trying to compare apples to oranges to see which one's better.
Yeah. Is there? I know you're on the X, at least for the time being. I don't know if there are other places that you want them to find you, if there's a website for the book or anything like that, but let's get them out there.
Sure. I mean, if my blog is www.pedagogyongrata.com, or I've got a second one too, mostly because...
Can you say that more slowly? Because that was really fast. Your Canadian speak is going too fast.
Okay. www.pedagogyongrata.com.
Pedagogy non grata?
Yeah, full disclosure, I started a second blog because We ran out of server space on that blog. I wrote too many articles. And the second blog is www.teachingbyscience.com. And admittedly, I ran out of server space on that one, and all new articles are uploaded as PDFs because I figured out a loophole on the server rules. If I upload a PDF, it doesn't count towards my page limit. So I've lost track of how many articles there are because I've gone way over the page limits and just started uploading tons of PDFs. But I've got a fan page too for the podcast, which is Pedagogy Not Grata on Facebook. And then I'm pretty active on X, at least for now. I do see sort of a little bit of a max exodus coming from X. I don't know if I'm going to participate in that or not, although I do appreciate why people want to leave the platform. But
Okay. Well, Nate, it's been a pleasure. Again, I definitely recommend folks get the book. We'll put it in the show notes, and hopefully they find that and this conversation helpful.
Thanks for talking to me. I enjoyed the conversation.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.